And if you are done with all of your answers, you can just collect them all together and stick them right on that white piece of paper in front of you.
I'm going to start just because I think we're going to be tight on time. So, feels weird. Does it sound weird? It's just me. So, to begin with, we just wanted to frame the conversation a little bit. And so, when the team was discussing how to maybe go about talking about this, we decided to start with sort of some basic economics, just to get our heads in the same place. And so I'm going to go through supply-demand curves. No, I'm really not going to go through supply-demand curves. It's way too complicated for me. So instead, I'm sorry, it feels really weird to hear. Instead, I'm going to talk about it in a much more simple way because that's the way I can understand some of these concepts. So last night, as I was thinking through this, I started talking to Kanan and Pax, my two boys, 8 years old and 5 years old, about a lemonade stand, right? And I was just sort of asking them questions and sort of trying to figure out how do they think about how to make decisions about economics, even at 8 years old and 5 years of age. And I think it was fascinating, a lot of their answers to some of these very basic questions were what drives everything from a lemonade stand to how rentals and houses work, right? Like the market for housing. And that is maybe not the central part of gentrification, but is a part of gentrification. So we started, I asked them at dinner, I said, so let's just assume we want to set up a lemonade stand and we have $20 to buy our supplies. And with $20 we can make 100 cups of lemonade, okay? And so they were sort of tracking with me and I said that includes your cups, your powder or your lemons, depending if you want to make fresh or powdered, your advertising, etc. And you guys, some of you know Kanan and Paxton and their personalities. You can imagine what kind of questions were coming at me. And so then I said, all right, so we set it up and we decide we're trying to make a decision about how much are we going to sell our lemonade for, right? And so I said, what's the first question that you're going to ask? And Kanan very quickly says, how much money do I want to make, right? So I said, all right, great question. How much money do you want to make? And he said, $100. All right, so you spent $20, he wants to make $100. I sort of clarified, because this is how my mind works, I said, is that profit or net? He said, I want to make $80 profit, $100 net, okay? So I said, okay, you want to make $100. How much do you have to sell each cup of lemonade for? Kanan said, $1 a piece. So I said, great, so we're going to set up a lemonade stand, and we're going to sell each cup of lemonade for $1 a piece, and the goal is to make $100 by the end of the day. And we have from about 9 a.m., we're going to set up at 9, we're going to close down at 5, okay? And then I asked a question that I think often doesn't get asked when we think about making money. I said, why? What are we using the money for? And Kanan said, to make money. And I think that's point number one. I think most economics, or a lot of economics, that's the goal, right? So that's important just to remember. The goal often is to make money, and the next question of what are you going to use that money for doesn't often get asked, or it's asked in a much more abstract way, not a very concrete way. So I said, all right, so just to make money, but let's talk about what we're actually going to use that money for. What do you want to use the money for? What are we going to use this $80 for that you're going to make? And Pax blurts in, he says, buy Pokemon cards, right? I was like, great, we're going to spend $80 on buying Pokemon cards. It's a lot of Pokemon cards. So we then had a conversation about, so do we think that Pokemon cards are something that you need or something that you want, right? And they were both able to sort of get to the point of like, we don't need this. This is like a luxury. And so then we had a conversation that sort of dug into what is the difference between needs and wants? And what would you say is something that you needed to make $80 for that would be a need? Like, what would you classify as a need? And they said, or Kanan said, like maybe if we had a family, we needed to feed our family. And this was how you were making your money to feed your family, right? And the point there was, we make money, and sometimes the person who's making the money selling the product, sometimes it's for a luxury, sometimes it's for something a lot more practical, and there's a whole spectrum between those things. It's not either or by any means, but there's a whole spectrum. Like, Kanan said, what if I wanted to get my mom a massage? She's working hard. Yeah, very, very thoughtful. But this was something, what if I needed $80 to pay for a massage? I wanted to show her that I love her, etc. She could benefit from that. So that's something that is maybe not Pokemon cards. It's maybe not feeding a family, but it's like sending a kid to college, right? Not a necessity, maybe. Not something that is a huge luxury, but something you want to do for someone that you love, right? So the why is important from the seller standpoint, and it's important to understand that, and there's a whole spectrum of that. And then then we sort of got into, well, as a seller, what if you could make more? What if you plan to make $80, but you started selling your product and people were going to pay, all of a sudden you realize, man, people pay $2 for this lemonade. Do you make more? Or do you say, no, I was happy with $80? And I think that's an important concept, and it goes back to that first point, which is generally, if our goal is to make money, when we can make more, our goal, we'll sort of make decisions to make more, right? So when you're thinking about a lemonade stand, I also asked them, and I said, so why do you think lemonade would work, and what type of season, like what time of the year would it work best in? And so they said, they sort of understood, we got to do it in the summer when it's hot, etc. Because that's when you're most likely to be able to sell the product. So you're thinking about who your market is and what the needs are for that market, right? And so then we walked through some hypotheticals about what affects demand. And one of the questions I said, all right, so you set up shop, where are you going to choose to set up this lemonade stand? And I wanted to throw in the concept of competition to them, so I said, you're both going to have your own lemonade stand. It's very interesting for siblings. And I said, all right, so you set up in 2 different places in the neighborhood. And I said, and let's say it's 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and you've only sold 20 cups. You wanted to sell 100, you've been selling at $1, you've only sold 20 cups, right? What are you going to do? And Kanan was like, probably lower my cost, right? And I said, do you think that that's going to help? He said, well, if people aren't buying at $1, maybe if I lower the cost, they'll buy more. I said, okay, what's another important thing to know? He said, well, how many people are walking by? Are there enough people even walking by, right? So it doesn't matter if you lower the cost if there's no customers at all. But if there are customers, lowering the cost might change how many cups get bought, right? So then I said, well, let's say, Kanan, you're over here on this side of the neighborhood, and Paxton, you're over here, and there happens to be a 5K race over on Kanan's side that day. And so there are all these people running, they're hot. They also are people who have sort of come into the neighborhood. They have a little bit more dispensable income. They're doing things like going to 5K runs. And maybe in this particular neighborhood, there aren't that many people who have the time, or culturally it's not a norm to do a 5K run. And so you're selling your lemonade over on your side of the neighborhood, and people are like, you're selling them like hotcakes, right? They're just flying off the stand. So after about, you sell 30 in the first hour, what do you think you're going to do to the price? He was like, go up to $1.50 or $2. And I was like, okay. And so you start selling them at $2. And the people both because of need and the ability to pay it, are paying that. And so you sell out. You sell out by noon. So you have you've sold out, you made more money than you're expecting because there's a different market and different need, and people who have that need have the ability to pay more. And then I said, so Kanan, Paxson, you call Paxson on your cell, and Paxson tells you that he's only sold 10 and that he's dropped the price to 50 cents. I was like, yeah. I was like, what would you do? You could either tell Paxson about this market that you have, where you've sold out, or you could go buy Paxson's lemonade for 50 cents, bring it over to your end of the neighborhood, and sell it for $2, and make a lot more money. What are you going to do? He was stuck. He knew what I wanted him to answer, but he was stuck. Like, he said, I can make a lot more money. So, sorry, this went off. So, there are these things about competition and about where the market is and who's buying. And then another part of that is sort of cultural, or the preferences of the buyers, right? So, taking away all of that stuff about the actual money and the competition, let's say, I said, what if you're in a place where, two different hypotheticals. One is, you've sold 80 cups, and there are 20 cups left that you want to sell. And two groups of people walk up. It's the end of the day, you're about to get rid of the last part of your supply. And one group of 20 is sweating, they're panting, they're like, they need something to drink. And they look at you and they're like, we can only afford 50 cents a cup. They need it really badly. And another group walks up, and they're really nice. They don't seem to they're not sweating quite as much. They're sort of on a stroll. And they're like, man, we really want to support you. We'll pay $2 a cup. What are you going to choose? You can take a theoretical loss on what your goal was and give it to the people who seem to be in more need. Or you could sell it to the person or the group that wants to buy it for $2 and make an even greater profit than you anticipated when you decided, here's how we're going to set up this whole stall, right? So real decisions. Cain was like, I don't want to make these decisions. That's literally what he said. He said, I don't want to make that decision. But that's a real decision. And then you get into, and this is the last point on this, and then I said, well, what if you start realizing, as you're out there selling your lemonade, that, some people are walking up and they're saying, hey, this lemonade's pretty good, but I would love it just like more sugar, a little bit more sugar added, and then I'll probably buy even more, right? And so there's these people who, like, their cultural preference is more like a sweeter lemonade, and they're willing, they want it, they'll pay $1 for it. And then all of a sudden you get this other group of people who they're like, I want it more tart, and I'll pay $1.50 if you make it more tart. Like, I'll pay more than what you're asking if you just change the taste a little bit. It doesn't cost you anything, and now you can make, or it costs you roughly the same to change the flavor, and you can make more money doing one versus the other. And Cain was like, I'm going to make it more tart. And what that means then is obviously one group of people with certain taste preferences gets the lemonade they like, and the other group, they might still buy the lemonade, but it's not really like sort of what they prefer, right? And they might say, well, I'm going to go over to another place where they serve me lemonade that I like. Again, all normal market principles at play. And I mean, obviously I was asking questions with sort of to try to figure out how a 5-year-old and an 8-year-old think about very difficult decisions. But it was just fascinating to hear their answers and hear them think through that. Because I don't think it's that different from how, whether or not we are consciously thinking about those questions, how housing works and communities work. So I'm going to back up now from that sort of those anecdotes to America as a whole and sort of what's happened over the last 50 to 75 years. So suburbanization, which was sort of the move of people from cities out of cities, was sort of the flavor of the day from about the 1950s to the mid-1980s to 1990s. And basically a lot of things drove that. A lot of forces drove that. I am in no way what I'm about to list is not complete, but it's just some of the forces that most people would agree upon. So during the Industrial Revolution and as cities became more and more crowded, they became more polluted, crime increased. There was not in that generation, diversity maybe was not valued as much or even talked, and so like homogeneity was something that people longed for, so even just sort of cultural norms around that was different. And the automobile came in to sort of in vogue, and so people could not only, all of a sudden people started building houses out in the suburbs, and you could get away from all of this high population, crime, pollution, and dealing with people that maybe you didn't understand or were not like you. And you could go and have a lot more space, lower crime, your children could play outside, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? And so that happened, and people went out of the cities en masse. And those were the cultural appeals and the product realities at the time. And what happened to housing costs in cities generally across America? They plummeted, right? And housing in most cities in America during this time went down. There was not a high demand. And so then we get into this gentrification, reurbanization, and late 1980s to present, we see these trends change. And some of the things that drove it, what would you guys guess? What things started to change in America, in cities? You can just throw out answers. Yeah, that made people want to come back into the cities. Like why did all of a sudden the demand go up in the cities? Gas, so meaning the gas costs went up, so people didn't want to drive as much, right? Lower prices, just like all of a sudden, maybe I could get a deal, right? Because the prices had dropped over the previous 40 years. What else? Yeah, so this is really interesting. There was the deindustrialization of American cities, right? So you look at Richmond, a bunch of tobacco factories, right? Like the city was a place where products were made in the 50s, 60s. Then it switched. What do we see in our city now? Law firms, banks, universities. What kind of people worked in factories versus what kind of people work in those places? Very different, right? Like as far as working class and who's coming in, et cetera. So all of a sudden you're changing who is coming into and working in the working spaces in your environment. What else? Crime started to go down significantly, and I'm going to use that as sort of a way to talk about it in the next couple slides, but crime plummeted. And it's really dramatic to see how far crime went down. What else? Different what? Yeah, what kind of things? What kind of things do the 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old, 30-year-old, 40-year-olds, like what are the things that are attractive to us now about living? Different architecture of homes, and a lot of like old homes, right? Like there's sort of this, we love going and like renovating old things. What else? What did you say? Yeah, so walkability became, Yeah, there's a shift for my generation of like, I actually don't really want, and this is not everyone, but there has been a significant number of who want to be in places where they can walk to restaurants and to get their hair cut and church. Yeah, exactly. There's the concept of walking and being around and seeing your neighbors and all of that was a big shift from my parents' generation, where it was sort of like, I want to drive home into my garage, walk into the house at the end of the day and not have to deal with anyone who interrupts my life, right? And it's just a shift. So that changed and continues to change pretty dramatically. Anything else that people can think of? Yeah, like a conceptual rejection. Yeah. What? Yeah, and I think that has, like, I think people would talk about the lack of community and relationship and all those things. I also think in connection to that is sort of this reversal of, at least conceptually, the value of diversity, right? I think that shifted some and is still shifting. Obviously, playing that out is complicated, but I think conceptually there's a different way of understanding that. Yeah, Doug?
It's a really popular TV show that was centered in the city for the 80s and centered in the suburbs.
Yeah, so for example?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And whereas before it was Cosby Show, Family Ties, yeah. Yep. Yeah, Tiff.
I mean, I think of like, when I think of late 90s, I realized that Bush came in 2000 and my hysteria came with like how I spend my money and my future and things like that. It just makes sense to buy big on cheap property than it would be to live exorbitantly when you're not sure what your portfolio and your future investment is doing. So it's like a mental mind shift on how you're spending your money and valuing things.
Yeah. And I think the economics of that, as a lot of as crime was going down and everything, people started seeing people, without even knowing they were doing it, they were sort of following the principles I was talking to Kanan and Paxton about of, hey, I can buy low and maybe sell high down the road. Yeah. So there's more to that, obviously, than that. But the prices started going up, right? And the prices are going up. So this is just crime. And this is one of the forces. So this is New York City. 1990, 2,300 murders in the city. 6 a day. 2013, 350. Less than 1 a day. Richmond. 1990, 461 murders, 1 every other day. Don and Florence lived through that in downtown Richmond. The last 3 or 4 years, 37 to 42. I think we're on track for about 34 this year if you sort of, I think we're at 20 at the end of July. So anyway, goes down dramatically, right? All of a sudden, the concept of moving there to moving into the city is less dangerous. If I have children, which a lot of people make decisions around that, like those differences drives you one way or the other and where you decide to live, if you have the option. So, high crime neighborhood back in the 1990s or early 1980s, low demand to live there, cost of houses and rentals is low. And then 1990s, mid-1990s or so, crime starts going down, gentrification, cultural forces change, sort of what we value changes. And this is, you can read books about this. The first people to move in most of these communities, mission-minded people and people they call fringe people. So LGBT, people who are like a lot of like punk, like people who live on the fringes of society and sort of feel like outcasts for whatever reason, are often the first people to move in. And definitely if you're not in one of those groups, it's almost never people with children. It's always young professionals who don't have children because the schools usually haven't turned around initially on the front end of this, right? So no one's going to, few people are willing to take that risk with their children. So these people come in, they usually have a little bit more dispensable income, and so new businesses start setting up shop. So in our community, I would say Captain Buzzy's, Hill Cafe, we're sort of on the front line. Que pasa? Que pasa? And so then you get in this cycle of gentrification. So people come and visit their friends, they come and visit these businesses, they hang out, they like see people maybe who look like them, there are products there that they like, they don't hear that many gunshots, and they start thinking, maybe I could move in there. Or they think, I want to join, like there's some amazing things, these mission-minded people, they're doing some amazing things, I want to join that, right? So for whatever reason, for all those reasons, demand starts going up, prices start increasing, it's just a market principle, and the cycle starts picking up momentum. And so then you go from Captain Buzzy's and Hill Cafe, and all of a sudden WPA opens up, and then Roosevelt, $30 entrees, and then Dutch and Company, and then Proper Pie, and so that's all normal, but you see how the cycle, and then who's coming to visit those places, and then when they're there, what do they see? They say, well, I could live here, or I could invest here, because clearly there's something going on that's it seems like this is on the up and up, right? And so, is this inevitable? Like, is there anything we can do? And I'm going to let Shekinah jump in here. Do you want me to just hit play? And then you're going to talk afterwards? Okay. So, but all of that, all of those unbiased things are happening in a historical context in our country. And they always are happening in a historical context wherever you are in the world. And this just sort of speaks to our historical context.
Dig deep into America's $17 trillion economy, and you'll find fractures beneath the surface. The spoils are split unevenly between men and women, old and young, high school dropouts, and MBAs. But one of the most divisive disparities is only skin deep. This is the economy in black and white. Everything you own, houses, stocks, cars, that's your wealth. In 2011, the wealth of the median white household was over $110,000. African Americans on average 17 times less, just over $6,000. And housing has a lot to do with it. For the average American, their home is the most valuable part of their portfolio. It's an investment that can appreciate with time, and it can be passed from one generation to the next. But the rate of homeownership among whites is 28% higher than that of blacks, and the lingering effects of segregation could be to blame. Discriminatory practices by the Federal Housing Administration prevented African Americans from buying houses in many suburban neighborhoods. The Fair Housing Act of 1968 sought to level the playing field. But by then, African Americans were entering a housing market that had already seen massive appreciation. Meanwhile, white families had seen their housing investment soar in value during their head start. Fast forward to the 21st century, minority groups were again victims of housing exploitation, this time by big banks. Bank of America and Wells Fargo, among others, were compelled to pay hundreds of millions of dollars in fines and restitution for pushing minorities into exploitative subprime mortgages and charging them higher rates and fees. This contributed to the fact that blacks and Hispanics lost nearly a quarter of their wealth between 2004 and 2010.
It's unbiased, so it does not matter. It does not matter what you look like or what your race is, but when you add in the social past of our history, when you add in all of the cultural components of the United States, specifically around race, those things significantly impact how economics and gentrification play out, especially in a neighborhood like ours. So I want to just take a couple of minutes to talk about what does gentrification experientially feel like when you add in that layer of our social history and looking at some of the policies and the practices for decades that have impacted African Americans specifically. So when we look at our neighborhood and we think about, the lemonade stand example, we think about Canaan and Pax, and we think about all of the questions that were asked, even without the intention of trying to harm a specific community, the effects of gentrification in our community typically looks like the middle class that is moving in, the folks who are re-entering are white, while the folks who are being displaced, like who may not be able to afford the increasing prices, are black. Right? So that feels like, in addition to just our history as a city, let alone as a country, it opens up so many of the wounds that have not healed yet, right? And so it's important as we think about gentrification in our context, and especially as people of God, that we are mindful and aware of our history and how that is playing out in this neighborhood. It's important that we consider the experiences of people who are not like us as we approach God and say, like, Lord, how do we respond to this? So I think the video did a really good job of setting some of that, like, cultural context, but I do just want to make sure we had a moment in this presentation to acknowledge that and acknowledge what that looks like for us here, what that feels like. And again, some of us had the opposite intention when we moved in. It was to be a part of this community and to help people, right, to pursue God's mission for this community. But the impacts of those decisions still are shaded and colored by race. And so it's important that we consider that. So right now, Ramesh is actually going to come back up and he's going to talk about more of those experiences. So when we look at different families and different people, how does gentrification play out? How could it play out? What could it look like? Because it's a very complex issue. Any questions for me? Okay, thank you. Oh, yeah. I forgot all about my slide. Okay, the hard facts. Right, so again, the market and economics are not biased at all. So it is just science, right? But our social practices and history, again, specifically when we look at race and class, have shaded what we are experiencing here. Yeah.
So hopefully I'll be a little quicker than I was last time, sorry. So we decided one of the ways to help think through this is just to talk about anecdotes, and these are theoretical people, but are actually based on true stories that we have encountered, like people that we know, or even some of us, our stories, and sort of how gentrification has played out in our lives. So theoretical family of three, they're making 2007, they're making about $22,000 a year after taxes, so that amounts to about $1,800 a month. Theoretically, and so they're living in this house, they're paying $750 a month, right? Theoretically, if you're to follow sort of what most budgeting guidelines would say, you should pay about 30% of your take home every month on housing, so that would be about $550 of $1,800. So they're having to pay already more than what most people would like to if you look at budgeting guidelines. But it's all, and their house isn't being taken care of very well. So in 2012, neighborhood starts to change, rental prices start going up, and their landlord, who bought the house in the 1980s for $40,000 or whatever, all of a sudden their house is worth $150,000 because of all the market forces that we discussed. And so the landlord comes to them and says, I'm giving you 30 days notice. I'm planning on selling my house. And whether that was because they needed more Pokemon cards, or because they wanted to send their child to college, or because they needed to feed their family, who knows? But they decided they wanted to sell the house and make whatever amount of money. So the family starts looking for another property in the community, and they can't find anything. And they are able to the best they can find is for about $900 a month. And so they have to move to another area in the city. So one anecdote, right? Based on a true story. So another anecdote, roughly same size family, making roughly the same amount. All of the financials are equivalent. They are actually paying more per month for their rent. And these mission-minded people, these theoretical mission-minded people come in and become friends with this family, some really cool things happen, and for that family, for that particular family, additional support structures are created. Because of these other resources, they are able to find a property that they can pay $500 a rent. There's some support, there's some sort of, they're able to pay off some debt, and anyway, they get into a place that's $500 a month. Eventually, they even end up being able to buy this house, and the mortgage payment ends up being $500 a month, which they can afford and fits within their budget. Their property value starts going up for all the same reasons. So they buy the house for 60 grand, paying $500 a month. The house now is worth $80,000. They're thinking about sending their child to college. They now have some equity that they can perhaps leverage to send their child to college. Same basic economic principles, living in the same community, two different, very different stories, outcomes, et cetera, right? But when they do this, they're contributing to the prices going up. And especially if they decide to sell their house at $80,000 to make money so they can send their child to college, right? So potentially smiley face, potentially not, I don't know. 60-year-old couple, let's call them Don and Florence. They 45, 43, 42. So they move in the 1980s. They buy their house. The demand's not that high, and costs in general for houses are much lower. They buy a house for 45 grand. Finances are tight. They're working for a local ministry or nonprofit. Property values plummet in the 90s because that's when crime was worse. The plummet, and so they almost lose their house because they can barely make the mortgage payments, which aren't that high, but they're working for a ministry and money is not easy. They almost get foreclosed on. They haven't paid off that much of their mortgage. They've taken out another mortgage to sort of make it through the hard times, and they find themselves in a situation where they can't even sell because the value of the house relative to what they have is lower. And so they're sort of on the verge of bankruptcy. But they sort of make it through that, and then the same 2012, the community starts changing, property value starts going up. They now are in a community where the nonprofits are paying a little bit more money than they were back in the 1980s. So or the ministry they're working for can now all of a sudden, instead of their salary can increase. So they are able to stay in the house. They get better jobs that pay them a little bit more. And then 2015, and their property is worth $100,000. They've made it through the rough times. And they're sort of feeling really good about their situation. Again, for them, there's a lot that they're excited about this gentrification stuff. It's a college-educated Sri Lankan couple, you know. So they are making about $40,000 a year when they move in. I don't know why Carolyn put those pictures up, by the way. Is that supposed to be Sri Lankan? I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. I'm messing with you. So they're working for a nonprofit, no children. They find a pretty good rental property for about $700 a month. Some of their friends in sort of the mission-minded community or nonprofit community sort of give them a deal because they think, oh, they're going to be stable and we want them to live here, et cetera, et cetera. They're able to save some money because they're not paying quite as much as maybe they would if they didn't have this relational, this relationship. And their salary slowly goes up. Over the next 2 or 3 years, property values start going up in the neighborhood again. They notice a $200,000 house that they really like, but they can't afford it currently on their salary. So they talk to their parents, And parents, they come from sort of a middle-class background. Their parents have a little bit of money stored up and would love to help them, and their parents think it's a pretty good investment opportunity. The parents are very aware of watching what's happened to their neighborhood since they watched their children move in to now 2013, 2014. So they buy it, property values start going up. 5 years down the road, they decide to sell. They make $100,000. The parents make it because the parents are the ones who have the mortgage. Parents decide, you know, we'll give you $50,000 gift to send our grandkids to college, and we'll keep $50,000, and it's great. Works out well, right? So again, for that particular family, so college-educated African-American couple moves into the neighborhood. Again, making sort of same situation, different race. They also are able to find a rental property that's worth that's sort of rented to them at a lower cost because of relationships they have. They have a child. Well done, well done. And they don't necessarily have the family backing that the Sri Lankan couple had, but they start realizing that they have access to some first-time home buyer loans, etc., which they apply for and they qualify for, and they're able to buy a house for $150,000, and it comes, you know, with their grants or whatnot, the price of the house actually, what they have to get a mortgage on is for about $100,000, which means that their mortgage payments are still really affordable to them. Property values continues to go up. After 5 years, property's doubled in value. And they think they probably can pay for their child's college. So the first family that I talked about and was sort of the one that got pushed out, right? All the others did well, generally, for them, but all of them are affecting that first family, right? Not because they're purposely affecting them, but it is. It's affecting what's happening for that first family. And so it's, you know, happy face, happy face, happy face for 4 people in these particular anecdotes, and there are lots of other anecdotes. I'm not in any way saying these are complete anecdotes. These were, but they have an impact on people that we know or don't know, where the face may not be a smiley face at the end of the day. Okay? Are there questions or comments or? Yeah. Are there, and what percentage? And I don't know. I imagine it's there, but I imagine it's pretty low, and I imagine it keeps getting lower. The other thing that we see, that I've seen with very specific people, is that as those older couples who are the homeowners are getting older and maybe passing away, their families are usually deciding to sell to make money off of it, which is not a bad thing. But they're selling again at these high prices because the demand has gone up. And there are certain people who have access, therefore, to those homes. And so the community, yeah, it starts so they're benefiting, but like the diversity of the community, socioeconomic diversity of the community starts changing. Or maybe it wasn't necessarily, I'm not arguing that it was diverse before, but it starts changing how it's homogenous. Maybe that's right. Yeah.